Neuroscientific theories and paradigms. We'll begin with the theory of emotions, starting with the common sense model. This dictates that the stimulus leads to an emotion, which then causes a person to label the emotion. So, for example, I'm happy, so I laugh. This was proposed to that our subjective experiences ultimately dictate our response. Next is the James Lange theory. William James, an American psychologist, many of you have probably heard of him, and Carl Lange, a Danish psychologist. So the James Lange theory suggests that emotions occur because of physiologic reactions to events. In other words, this theory proposes that people have a physiologic response to environmental stimuli, and that their interpretation of that physical response then results in an emotional experience. So the stimulus causes the response. Cannon-Bard theory was co-developed by Walter Cannon, who discovered many functions of the autonomic nervous system, and Philip Bard. The two of them together state that the physiologic reaction and the emotion occur when the experience happens. So it's the physiological response and the emotion. The belief is that the physiologic response and the emotion happen simultaneously. Schachter-Singer is oftentimes referred to as the two-factor theory, which emphasizes the cognitive aspect along with the physiologic component. So it states that exposure to a stimuli, such as an angry person, causes the person to interpret their emotional reaction according to the stimuli, in this case, anger. So it's the physiologic response plus the thoughts equal the emotion. So there's some others. There's facial feedback hypothesis. Eck is one person, Paul Eck is one person that has done a great deal of work about facial expressions that provide feedback about emotional expressions, which can cause feelings or emotions to intensify. There are things like the cognitive mediation model, which dictates that a stimulus must be interpreted in order to respond physically and emotionally. There are things in positive psychology movement that is based on the suggestion that if you shift your focus away from negative things to things that are more positive, you will actually change your emotional state. Ledoux has put out some fabulous writings and some fabulous work that proposes instantaneous responses. He and another researcher, I believe his name is pronounced Zajonc, believe that not all emotional reactions involve cognition. And then Damasio has again written some fabulous work that he talks about about patterns of brain activity. Something to remember is that emotions and emotional expression have multiple explanations, from cultural to physiologic to cognitive and more. What we do know is that emotions are related to physiological arousal, expressive behavior, and conscious experience, all of which are biological and personal. Theory of mind is the development of traits that are highly dependent upon relational interactions early in life. It really dictates the way that people understand others, how we refer to cognitive capacities, the interactions, interpretations, and development. And it's also defined as the ability to hold complex thoughts about ourselves and others and the world around us. Kind of think back to the relational rupture and repair stuff that we had talked about earlier. Paradigms and models. So they are defined as a conceptual framework or approach within which a scientist works. It's a basic set of assumptions. So a general perspective that defines how to conceptualize and study a subject, gather and interpret data. It's really about how we think about a subject. What is investigated at a point in time. So there are genetics, neuroscience, cognitive behavioral, and then something I believe is really important called diathesis stress. This is accumulative stressors in combination with behavioral and genetic factors lead to negative health states. Starting out here with emotional health and well-being. So we'll begin with the biomedical model. It's really a Western model that's supported by scientific inquiry and empirical studies. It truly lends itself to a very reductionistic way of viewing things. Kind of the thought process is that if I can narrow it down to the least common denominator, then I can know what I'm dealing with, and I can target a treatment to eradicate whatever that issue is. So the thinking also then tends to create a great deal of separation between mind and body. It looks at health as the absence of disease or dysfunction, abnormality or deviation of organs or structures, and the eradication of illness will ultimately restore health. In the biopsychosocial model, this was proposed by Engel, and it supports the belief of multiple factors that influence health. As the name implies, there is greater inclusion of multiple elements of why and what may be causing illness and what may be influencing health. In the wellness model, this adds quality of life and spirituality to the biopsychosocial model. Sadly, in most Western models of health, spirituality is barely mentioned, if at all. But most people know that this is an important aspect for health and healing, as well as a basis for a lot of support, whether that is in the form of a religious community, a belief in a higher power, or the feeling of connectedness to all beings. Social ecological, the focus here is on the physical and psychological environments, health systems, and policies. So these may be seen as separate or in combinations based on a practitioner or a provider's background and level of comfort in discussing topics of health, wellness, and support with patients and clients. There are theories and models of health. So we'll start with the expectancy model. This was adapted from its original purpose of explaining behavior to explaining health behavior. There are values that are assigned to the outcome of behavior. In social cognitive theory, this was developed by Bandura, who was a researcher and a scientist who studied social learning, developed social learning theory. And this is really focuses on the cognitive processes that are critical to acquisition and regulation of behavior. The theory of reasoned action is that behavior determines intention, that attitudes about behavior and subjective norms. The theory of planned behavior. Behavior is determined by intention, attitude, subjectivity, and perceived control. Health belief is the perception of severity, susceptibility, benefit, and barriers. Self-efficacy is seen as a major factor in this. And then there is the transactional model of behavior change. This was originally proposed and developed by Prochaska and DiClemente. This is used a lot in behavior, health modification, behavior change, addiction, and health, again, health behavior. So the change happens in stages. A lot of you may be familiar with this. It's pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, action, and maintenance. Some final thoughts. So I want you to think about the connections to brain structures and functions in models and paradigms presented, to be able to recognize the complexity and interaction in all of them, and that no one theory or paradigm covers it all, but perhaps one may resonate more with you than another, but just to have a broad overview of many of these things that may be covered in other areas. Again, you may be familiar with some of these things and you may be curious, so giving you the opportunity to explore further on your own. And of course, your references.